Episode 5, Part 1, Power, Donors, and the Epstein Connection, the Summers Case. Before we begin, a quick note. This episode discusses publicly reported information about Larry Summers, Jeffrey Epstein, and their connections to Harvard University. All information presented is based on publicly available reporting, institutional records, and released documents, and this episode is intended for analysis and commentary in an academic context. It is not legal advice and does not assert claims beyond documented sources. Files open, glass poured. Let's talk academia. Before we begin, make sure to like, subscribe, turn on notifications, and leave a comment, because this is one of those episodes where the internal academic perspective is going to feel very different from what you may have seen in headlines, especially once we move beyond the surface and into how these relationships actually function inside universities. Tonight's drink is a Boulevardier, bourbon, Campari, and sweet vermouth. It appears balanced and composed at first, but the bitterness builds slowly and lingers in a way that is difficult to ignore, which is exactly how this case unfolds once you begin to understand the people involved, the decisions that were made, and the amount of time over which those decisions accumulated. Take a sip. This one unfolds in layers. This is Episode 5, and it is a two-parter. Part 1, Power, Donors, and the Epstein Connection, the Summers Case. Part 2, Harvard, Accountability, and Institutional Protection, the Summers Case. To understand why this case lands the way it does inside academia, you have to begin with who Larry Summers is, not simply as a public figure, but as someone who represents the very top tier of academic, political, and institutional power. Summers was born into one of the most intellectually elite families in modern economics, with both of his parents working as economists, and close relatives, Paul Samuelson and Kenneth Arrow, winning Nobel Prizes, which places him from the outset inside a world where intellectual authority, prestige, and influence are not exceptional outcomes, but expected ones. He studies economics at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, earns his PhD at Harvard, rises rapidly through the faculty ranks, and establishes himself as a leading scholar in macroeconomics, public finance, and labor markets before moving into government as U.S. Treasury Secretary under President Bill Clinton and later director of the National Economic Council under President Barack Obama. By the time he returns to Harvard University, he is not just an academic. He is operating at the highest levels of influence across academia, government, and global finance simultaneously. He serves as Harvard's president from 2001 to 2006, and after stepping down, he remains at the university as an Elliott University professor, Harvard's highest academic title, while also teaching at the Harvard Kennedy School and serving as co-director of the Masavar Ramani Center for Business and Government, placing him at the center of elite policy education and institutional leadership. So when this situation unfolds, this is not a marginal figure making a questionable decision. This is someone at the absolute peak of institutional authority. And his earlier controversies matter here because they establish a pattern. In 2005, Summers delivered remarks on women in science suggesting, framed as hypotheses, that differences in representation at the highest levels might partly reflect differences in aptitude variability between men and women. He later clarified and apologized, stating he did not believe women were less capable, but the reaction within academia was immediate and intense, with faculty criticism, national backlash, and institutional fallout that ultimately contributed to his resignation as Harvard president. From that point forward, Summers carried a reputation that is essential to understanding this episode. He was widely seen as brilliant and influential, but also as someone who, at times, exercised questionable judgment in highly visible ways. And that context becomes critical once Jeffrey Epstein enters the picture. Epstein had no meaningful academic credentials, no scholarly contributions, and no legitimate role within higher education. Yet he embedded himself within elite institutions through wealth, access, and strategic relationships, positioning himself as a donor and connector within networks that included academia, finance, and politics. More importantly, by 2008, Epstein was a convicted sex offender, and his conduct had been widely reported, making him one of the most reputationally toxic figures imaginable for an academic to be associated with. And yet, Summers maintained a relationship with him. According to reporting from the Harvard Crimson, Summers continued communicating with Epstein for years after his conviction, engaging in exchanges that extended beyond professional necessity into personal and relational territory, including seeking advice on a romantic relationship involving a woman he described as a mentee, forwarding private communications, and relying on Epstein as a confidant. The two also discussed fundraising efforts, including support connected to a poetry program led by Summers' wife, further illustrating how personal, professional, and financial relationships were intertwined. At one point, Epstein referred to himself as Summers' wingman, a characterization that, within this context, signals not distance but familiarity and trust, which is precisely what faculty found so troubling. From an academic perspective, this is where the issue becomes indefensible. This is not incidental association. This is sustained engagement with someone whose reputation and conduct were already well established. And the situation becomes even more difficult to reconcile when you consider what Summers was doing publicly at the same time. Following the October 7th campus protests, Summers became one of the most vocal critics of Harvard leadership, particularly targeting Claudine Gay, arguing that the university was not responding adequately to anti-Semitism and calling for stronger institutional accountability. We will discuss Gay, her leadership, and the broader institutional response in a later episode of the Ivory Tower Files, because that is its own complex and significant case. But within this context, what matters is the contrast. Summers positioned himself as a moral authority, publicly criticizing institutional leadership, while having exercised deeply questionable judgment in his own professional relationships. That contradiction did not go unnoticed. Now, widen the lens further. Epstein's network extended beyond academia, and one of the clearest examples is Prince Andrew, who lost his royal duties, titles, and institutional standing following his association with Epstein, and is now commonly referred to as Andrew Mountbatten, reflecting a complete loss of formal identity tied to that role. That is the standard. And within academia, where titles, roles, and reputation define everything, the expectation is even more stringent. This is why Elizabeth Warren's intervention carried so much weight. Warren, the Leo Gottlieb Professor of Law Emerita at Harvard Law School, is not only a senator, but a scholar who has spent decades studying financial systems, institutional power, and accountability. And when she called for Harvard to cut ties with Summers, she was articulating what many faculty were already thinking. At that point, the outcome becomes inevitable. Summers steps back from teaching at the Kennedy School, takes leave from his courses, resigns as co-director of the Masava Rahmani Center, withdraws from public roles, including his position with OpenAI, and ultimately announces that he will retire from Harvard, stepping away from his faculty appointments entirely. Importantly, he was not the only Harvard-affiliated figure connected to Epstein. Faculty such as Martin Nowak were also scrutinized for their ties, and questions were raised about how funding, access, and donor relationships shaped academic work. But Summers was the most visible, the most powerful, and the one who most publicly claimed moral authority. And that is why the reaction was so severe. From a faculty perspective, this becomes a very real conversation. What do students think when someone teaching future leaders at the Kennedy School exercises this level of judgment? What do colleagues think when someone holding the highest academic title at Harvard engages in this kind of relationship? What happens to credibility when actions contradict public positions so clearly? Because at this point, Summers is not simply being criticized. He is being reframed. In some media coverage, even openly mocked in ways that signal not just disagreement, but a collapse of professional respect. And academia does not easily recover from that kind of reputational shift, because in this world, your title matters, your role matters, your judgment matters. And when judgment fails at this level, everything else becomes secondary. Summers had power, prestige, wealth, institutional protection, and still exercised extraordinarily poor judgment. He flew too close to the sun, and for faculty, that is the lesson. Immediate, concrete, unavoidable. If you've made it this far, like the video, subscribe, turn on notifications, and leave a comment, because this is exactly the kind of case where understanding how academia actually works reveals a much sharper story than what appears on the surface. Final note. This episode is based on publicly available reporting, institutional records, and released documents, and is intended for analysis and commentary in an academic context. It is not legal advice and does not assert claims beyond documented sources. Finish your Boulevardier, because in Part 2, we stay with Harvard. Episode 5, Part 2, Harvard, Accountability and Institutional Protection, the Summers Case. And that is where the focus shifts from Summers as an individual to the system itself. How universities rely on donors, how faculty secure funding, and how institutional priorities shape decisions that, over time, lead to outcomes like this. Refresh the glass, because Part 2 is where the real structure gets exposed.